I'd like to welcome all of you to our panel today, which is about Europe and Europe's role in the world and how Europe sees Asia. Let me just give you all a brief roadmap. So way to my right is former Prime Minister Fillon of France. And his only flaw in judgment is thinking that he is incapable of speaking good English. So he will give a few opening remarks that he has practiced. And then we're going to talk about Europe in what I see as a bipolar world dominated by the US and China. You know, to what extent is globalization a dying force? To what extent does it even make sense to talk about such a thing as Europe? And then we're going to talk about Europe-Asia. And then the conversation will move to the left side, where we have somebody from Japan and somebody who has a Chinese face, but as IFC is a Bretton Woods kind of person, a citizen of Bretton Woods. And David is the agnostic person who will respond to everything. So that's the roadmap. Prime Minister, thank you so much.
So thank you very much. When you ask me to speak about the future of Europe, I think it's interesting to start with this dramatic event which occurred this summer and which could symbolize the European question, is the collapse of the Morandi Bridge in Genoa in Italy. 43 people died when the road collapsed under their vehicles. This is not only a symbol of Italy aging infrastructure, but the management of this crisis by the new Italian government shed a very cruel light on Europe's deep crisis. 8 hours after the collapse of the bridge, while the rescuers were fighting against time to try to save victims, the Minister of Interior, which is the leader of the Northern League, denounced, 8 hours, denounced the concession contract of the motorway company responsible for operating the bridge. No investigation, no standing back. The trial of liberalism necessarily responsible for the lack of maintenance of the structure. Some hours after, the same Minister of Interior accused Europe to be responsible of the drama because Europe is depriving Italy of the necessary resources to maintain its infrastructure. And some hours after, I was on holidays in Tuscany, so I look at the Italian TV, and I saw this very interesting video of one of the leaders of the other part of the Italian government, 5 Stars. And this leader, some years ago, was explaining that it's not necessary to rebuild this bridge, and this bridge will end during 100 years. So one could draw the conclusion from this dramatic episode that Europe is an old continent with no future, a great civilization on the verge of dying out, in the image of that Italy, whose cities of Rome, Florence, Venice, and Genoa dominated the world and whose bridges are crumbling. But the situation in Italy is not unique. The United Kingdom is struggling with a disastrous Brexit, whose purpose no one sees anymore. Germany is struggling to find compromises between all democratic political forces, while the far-right demonstrations are multiplying. Austria, Hungary, and Poland are moving away from the European values on which the Union is based. Spain is mined by separatist forces, and France comes out of the summer with a hangover, discovering that there is no magician and that the debate between the left and the right is necessary for the functioning of democracy. On the other side of the Atlantic, President Trump struggles with his accusers, handles provocation with constancy, but above all, amplifies the retreat of American influence in the world. The unilateral denunciation of the Iranian nuclear treaty, the arm wrestling with Turkey, the trade war with China, the contempt shown for the German Chancellor, all contribute to the end of Washington leadership and the birth of a chaotic and dangerous multipolar world. I don't know if it's the right expression, but the alpha male fight
works
between Trump and Erdogan, for whatever reason, good or bad, will lead to the rapprochement already underway between Ankara, Tehran, and Moscow. So Turkey, Iran, and Russia have in common that they are true nations with a 1,000-year history, and they will not bow their heads to American threat. I think there are people who have many reasons to be dissatisfied with their leaders, will nevertheless come together in a spirit of national resistance that will meet with many echo in the world. In short, the outcome of this confrontation is disastrous for the West and threatens world peace. At the same time, Islamic totalitarianism, far from regressing, is gaining ground in heart and minds. Terrorist acts are on the rise in Southeast Asia. In Afghanistan, the recent revelation of a dialogue between the Taliban and the Trump administration announces the defeat of the West and the return to power of the fundamentalists. And in the Sahel, French forces are finding it increasingly difficult to contain the jihadists and are setting into an endless military operation. In the same time, China is continuing its development and is methodically building the structure that will enable it to become the leading economic power and assert its influence on the Asian continent and Africa with the Silk Road, but also with the impressive growth of a military tool that far exceeds the needs of its security. So America is gradually losing its status as the world's policeman, but China is not about to replace it, in my view. Why? Because it's not in Chinese culture, and because America may be in decline, but it retains many assets, its thriving economy, its scientific and technological capabilities, its universities, the flexibility of its economic and social system, its financial institution, and especially its currency, which remains a world currency for better or for worse. So to conclude this quite pessimistic picture of the situation, America is declining, China is rising, but China is not going to replace America. So we will have, in my thinking, a long period of trouble and instability in the world. And the question for Europe now it's, do you accept this situation or do you react? And my thinking it's Europe can react by focusing its policies priority on just 5 strategic questions. The currency. I think if Europe wants to play a role in the future, Europe needs a true international currency to be able to compete with the dollar and tomorrow with the Chinese currency. We need borders and a true immigration policy. we need a common defense policy, because I think the US alliance, the US defense is no more, is not enough to ensure the European security in the future. We need a European policy on digital and new technology question, and we need a European policy in energy matters. And all the other questions, in my mind, should be no a European responsibility, but a national one. Maybe I speak too long, and I think there is enough matters to start a discussion.
We'll start with the dark side, and then we will go on to what Europe can...
I'm sure Peter Mandelson will be more optimistic than me.
We will start with the dark side, and then we will talk about what Europe can do to be more of a player. But before I turn to Lord Mandelson, let me ask you one question. You know, you talk about a world in which, you know, the US is slowly abdicating. China is not about to replace it. To what extent does Europe become collateral damage in this tension between the US and China?
You know, when I used to say that the Chinese plates, like in geological
tectonic plates, yeah.
The Chinese plate is rising. The North American plate
subsiding.
Yes, and Europe is in the middle. So when you are in the middle, there is two solutions. You can be crushed, or you can become high mountains.
Yeah.
So I think there is an opportunity for Europe to play a role as an old continent and old civilization. You know, Europe have no more imperialism pulsion. We are too old for that. But we are able, I think, to promote a more human world with sort of good compromise between the North American views and what happens in Asia. The only question is, the European would be able to unite, to find a way to play a role as a power. And at this time, I'm not able to answer to this question.
So let's see what Lord Mandelson has to say. Let me turn to you, Lord Mandelson. You know, the Prime Minister referred to an alpha male fight between Trump and Turkey. Is there an alpha male fight between the US and China? And is globalization the victim of that?
The short answer is yes, there is an alpha male fight between the US and China. They are embarking on a very serious strategic competition, at the heart of which is supremacy in artificial intelligence and supercomputing. That's the sort of pivot around which this race is revolving. But no, I do not believe that globalization as such is going to be the casualty of that. Let me explain what I mean. First of all, I think that there are three power centers in the world. One is the United States, another is China, and the third is Europe. The problem that the world faces is that we're going through a period in which those three power centers are cooperating and collaborating less well than at any time we have seen in recent decades. Globalization needs to be managed, it needs to be policed, it needs to be governed by rules. That requires global institutions in which the three power centers collaborate to enable them to operate effectively. If those three power centers are not in sync, then international institutions will work less well and rules will be enforced less effectively, and governance and globalization will be set back by that but not destroyed.
So let me ask you a follow-up question. Is the United States still associated with globalization at a time when the White House says America first?
United States business, United States participation in global supply chains, the universal sort of presence of American capital, know-how, drive is of course at the center of globalization at the same time as the US president is trying to step away from it and outside international institutions. So if you're asking me whether I think President Trump's stance, his America First approach is going to lead to the decline or removal of American capital, American manufacturing firepower, the answer is no in the global economy. America's economic fire will outlast the president in his term in the White House, whether it's one term or two. But if I may, and I'd just like to qualify what I've said in this, since you've mentioned Mr. Trump. Look, first of all,
unavoidably, and regrettably.
Well, unavoidably, you as an American say regrettably. I, of course, would respect the. Anyway, globalization is being affected by three things, in my view. One is a mood shift amongst the public, particularly, but not only, across the West, in the United States and Europe. This is a questioning or a challenging of the sort of borderless world which globalization is creating. A borderless world in which people in the West see foreign goods, foreign capital, foreign people, coming into the West at the same time as manufacturing capability and economic power is shifting east. And obviously, in that sort of rewriting or rebalancing of the global equation, people in the West are going to feel on the defensive. They feel that things are moving away from them, or put it a different way, others, notably China, are coming over here and eating our lunch. So this is bound to lead to a sort of a sense of insecurity and of fear. But why is it suddenly so exacerbated in the way that it is? Because what I've described has been going on for 2 or 3 decades. So the reason is that suddenly people feel or have focused on the fact that the fruits of economic growth internationally, the fruits of globalization, are being distributed very unequally amongst people. And what the global financial crisis did was to bring this into a sort of sharp relief, and it has created a political momentum or backlash which has been very ably and skillfully exploited by political populists, both of the left and the right. Populism is not an ideology. Populism is not a set of ideas, let alone a set of policy solutions. Populism is a device, a political device for dividing people, setting people against each other, and creating political advantage for populists. The simple truth is that economics has worked better at generating wealth and prosperity than politics has done in distributing its fruits and its benefits. So it is politics in a very large sense that has failed globalization rather than economics. And this has led to a weakening of the pro-globalization consensus in the West. Politics and governments across the West, but I would say probably in Asia as well, have become more short-term, less long-term,
So
more transactional in their relationship, and more national in their perspective than international.
One follow-up question from that. Your talk about divisions, following on the Prime Minister's reference to a Europe in deep crisis, the rise of populism, is that all incompatible with Europe, quote unquote, as a concept? Does it make sense to refer to Europe anymore?
Of course. I don't happen to believe that Europe is in deep crisis. I think that the remarkable feature of Europe is that it has been able to survive a series of very serious crises over the last 10 years. It's gone from a banking and financial crisis, which sparked a political crisis between Northern and Southern Europe. It has got through the financial, the political. It then entered a massive refugee crisis that had a major impact on politics in Europe. It has got through very serious terrorist events that destabilized public confidence in their governments. And last of all, it's surviving and getting through the loss to the European Union of one of its largest and most important members. I'm talking about Brexit. Now, if Europe and the European Union can survive all those consecutive crises and still emerge broadly intact, broadly united, with its sort of economic mojo restored, then it has, in my view, the basis or the platform on which to do or to aspire to achieve many of the things that Francois Fillon has talked about. But let's be under no illusions here. Whilst Europe is surviving sort of intact, the transatlantic alliance, the relationship between Europe and the United States, is not in a healthy state as a result of Mr. Trump's tenure in the White House, and nor are international institutions in a healthy state either. You just have to look at the WTO, which is at the heart of our rules-based international trading system, to see that whilst the US is not quitting the WTO, it is in effect boycotting it. It's making the WTO's ability to enforce international trade rules extremely difficult, and their ability to formulate new trade rules relating to e-commerce, digital trade, the management and governance of cross-border data flows, impossible for the time being whilst he is in the White House. Now, this is giving, in my view, an especial advantage to China over the West, because whilst the West is unable to manage with coherence, cohesion, the main pursuit of its values and its interests in a collective will, that can only give an advantage to that sort of third leg of the stool, which is China.
I'm now going to turn to the other side, and I'm going to start with you, Tamura-san. Yep. Let me ask you, does Japan see Europe as a significant force in the world today? Does Japan feel that as the United States embraces more of a America First policy, which suggests that everything is zero-sum, that it's all about the unilateral? How does Japan see the world today? And do you feel that you are under pressure to choose between a declining US and a rising China? And then I'm going to turn to you, David.
So I used to be a politician. I used to be working for the government. But now I quit those jobs. So I'm now representing my country. I want to say that first. But in my opinion, the Europe is still important. So we see carefully the European situation. I'm very surprised how pessimistic this sounds like, but we tend to think Japanese are the most pessimistic human being in the world, but you are much more than us. So, for example, per capita GDP-wise, European nation is going up. Japan is stagnant or rather coming down, and the population-wise, we are shrinking. But you're taking people from outside. Although the fact is that, but your population is growing. So you're doing good job. And you're doing great job with China. In China, we start to be very friendly to China. We are now hedging to China. Let me explain it after that why we are now very friendly to China. So, so many French technology are implemented in Chinese development. The building infrastructure, high-speed trains, airplane building, and German technology as well. So you make money in China. We're not making money in China. Only Uniqlo is making money. So good job done. And we are now carefully learning from you what's the limit of the economic cooperation. So now we are building TPP, RCEP, including China, and ASEAN, Japan, ASEAN, China, Japan. So we expect a lot, but all those things are, what we learn from European Union. So we see the good point, but we see the limit. So you are the role model for us. So so you can be positive. And going back to the point you mentioned, very interesting. So we are sandwiched by two giants. And two giants are for me, look like leader. Dictator-like, and very love to cut deals. And both of them way of thinking is like a real estate developer. The real estate developer is there in the US, and Mr. Xi Jinping, One Belt, One Road, it's like a real estate developer. So they are really look alike. So the biggest fear of Japan, I think, I'm not representing, he is representing Japan. So my opinion is that the worst case scenario for Japan is both of them cut a deal. Like dividing the global map. Okay, China, I give you until Guam, free of charge. So you take Japan, Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, ASEAN. But after Guam, that's all ours. So that kind of deal is very, very, we are, afraid of. The reason why Prime Minister Abe tried to amend the constitution is not, to revive the military Japan. We are too weak. We are so aged. We don't have, we are people like this, so we don't fight anymore. So don't be afraid. But in order to deal with the current situation, for the diplomacy, you need two M's, money or muscle. We have still some money. So what we do for diplomacy is giving money, basically. But money has a limit. In order to be a very good diplomat, you need to show your muscle might. But we need to have some capability for, defend ourselves and to help rescue other people, other countries. That's why Prime Minister Abe is trying to build up more defense or military capability. So in worst case scenario is that, but in order to evade that scenario, what we need to do is that to hedge. Now we are hedging to China, finally. Officially, Prime Minister Abe announced we will help One Belt, One Road project, finally this year. And now Japan, EU has an EPA for the first time, the massive scale. Now Japan is taking lead of the leadership of making TPP happens, and even RCEP, Japan is a leader. So we would like to put the constructive pressure to the United States. If you don't work as a leader, we work with our other friends. But we don't want to piss him off because we have other problems in the peninsula nearby. So Japan is in the difficulty, but we have to be ready. That's why Prime Minister Abe is trying to amend the constitution. And Europe, you have still a chance. And let's work together. That's
Very interesting, Tamura-san. Let me ask you one more question before I switch to David. And that is, it's impossible in today's world to distinguish geopolitics from economics and finance. If you look at China, clearly from an economic point of view, it represents huge opportunity for Japanese companies.
Yes.
Every one of the Japanese trading companies will love to be part of Belt and Road Initiative. And, you see Japan trying to preserve its influence through JICA, through Japan Development Bank of Japan, through JBIC, doing projects all over Asia.
Yes.
So from an economic point of view, it clearly makes sense for Japan to partner with China. From a geopolitical point of view, as you keep referring to North Korea, China is a little more problematic from Japan. On a net basis, do you see China as more of a threat or an opportunity?
Yeah, they are both. But you made a very good point. I cannot say thank you, but thanks to North Korea, we are getting closer. Because to handle that country, one country is not enough. So now we are working closely with China. Back to the economic point, still underestimation is going on among Japanese business circle about China. China is a copycat. China is just bad behavior, pushing into the queues or something like that. But you should understand Chinese technology is getting better. One of them are surpassing those of Silicon Valley. You mean AI, robotics. 80% of the drone in the world is done by Chinese. And the BYD, the EV company, the largest EV company in China, is 2.5 times bigger than Tesla. So China is the third country to send a man into the space. So we should respect that. And Japan has some, still we have something complementary relationship economic-wise. And of course, we must be carefully work with Chinese business. But some Chinese business still still want to have the Japanese craftsmanship like techniques and technologies, and some of the advanced technologies like fintech. In Shanghai, nobody carry cash. The guy carrying cash in Shanghai is only me, like a Stone Age guy. They do everything in smartphones. Government is watching everyone through smartphones or CCTV cameras, so many of them. China is very safe, but impressive. And, they have a little, they have a very different type of treatment to human rights and privacy. So, they can use 1.4 billion people data. So data is a fuel. So their AI and the supercomputer is getting much faster. Algorithm is getting better every day. So we need to learn. Of course, economic, exploring business opportunity in China is not only helping China, but also, getting something from China. So China is the opportunity. We should focus on that, but carefully,
Thank you. So David, I'm going to turn to you now. Tamura-san suggests clearly that from a Japanese business point of view, it makes much more sense to deal with China than the US. Can you talk a bit about how you see that choice for Europe, for Japan, for everyone who's sort of looking at US and China? And you had some wonderful data points illustrating, China's growing footprint in the world today. And, one of Lord Mandelson's points was very interesting about technology. In a world where everything is dual-use technology, civil and military, do you also see that China will clearly be an ascendant military power as well as a civilian power? You know, your point about drones, right? Perfect example of civilian and military dual-use technology.
Thank you. I think the best starting point for answering and addressing all of these very broad-ranging issues is to kick off with, where does global growth come from? Because the intricate linkages between economics and therefore the geopolitics are just too big to ignore. If we were to go back to the beginning of the 2000s, you would have, when you're thinking where global growth comes from, you would have started with the US and with Europe, and then you would have thought as a secondary thing, what else are we thinking about the rest of Asia and elsewhere? Today, it's gone the other way around. If you use PPP exchange rates, 60% of global growth, not just this year, but we think for the foreseeable future, comes from Asia, half of that from China, the other half from the ASEAN and South Asia regions. So when we're thinking through from the economic lens, this was something that we were seeing taking place from decades ago, where if you start applying similar types of institutions, technology, economic structure, then you will end up actually seeing your economy's share of global GDP head in the direction of your economy's share of the world's population. And that's what we've been talking about for many years. Actually, the process has gone even more aggressively in the direction we thought of the relative strength of Asia versus others as a result of the much weaker economic performance in the West ever since the global financial crisis. So that as a starting point, we know that that dominance is there, and it comes with, eventually, as you become the largest and most dominant part of global growth, which in many ways, if we take a really long perspective, Asia always was over the centuries. That's the way it was. Why shouldn't we go in that direction and acknowledge that? The question is, or I think the big challenge that we have right now, and it does allude to a lot of the topics we've been talking through, is what if you have a world where the institutions that were set up that have created where we are today are being increasingly questioned in terms of them being the right ones with enough rules in place to deal with an entity such as China, particularly on the accusations there have been on technological transfer, on the, let's say, state capitalism. Is a WTO, for example, in a position to deal with that? Can they change the rules? Many of the grievances that, say, the US has been voicing and then turned into almost a reality TV style approach, as we've seen more recently, are similar grievances that Europe has too. What I would get nervous about in the coming years is, one, whether the US-China tensions on multiple angles becomes something that is not going away. It only continues to bubble, with or without Trump. It's a much broader view in Washington as well as Europe. But what if you get some of that populist politics creeping into Europe as well, where right now you could look at it as the anchor, the friend, the point of stability? What if that becomes more unhinged as well? Won't we then get even more nervous about what the global structures could look like? And I think for companies, it is a difficult one to navigate on where we're going. So those uncertainties, those tail risks, those tensions are there, even though actually for businesses, they like what they see in terms of getting a lot more use of globalization, seeing even more growth coming from even more places around the world. That there is a tension there that I think is going to be hard to go away anytime soon.
Thank you. Now, I have a confession to all of you. I've known Jingdong a long time, and I asked if he could be on this panel because I think that many people today see China as it was rather than for how it's changing. So I've asked Jingdong to come and talk a bit about reform in China, to inject a slightly optimistic note in this quite dark discussion.
Well, Henny, thank you very much. I do feel the odd man out in this panel. We have political leaders, and I'm a development banker. So before I turn to a little bit on China, you know, there is a saying in English that grass is always greener. So I certainly have something more positive to share on Europe. But since it's a European panel, I think my friend Tamura-san could fake as a good Italian. He is always impeccably dressed. I'm just a poor Irish cousin, yeah? Now, with that said, let me put it this way. Over the past 25 years, I've been working in Bretton Woods institutions. And as you know, Bretton Woods is a symbol of multilateralism. And European shareholders have been the strongest supporter of multilateralism. Just give you a couple of examples. that last year, IFC, IFC is a global leader in private sector investment as part of the World Bank Group. Over the past 60 years, we have crowded in over $1 trillion into emerging market. And Europe is a big part of it. Just last year, give you an example, almost a fifth of our investment in emerging market countries have European sponsors. As a matter of fact, the very first transaction IFC did in 1957 was with Siemens, a German company, in Brazil. And our very first investment in China in 1985 was with a French car maker, Peugeot. So certainly Europe is very strong. Another European leadership is really on climate, on regulatory reform. Yeah. So every year, last year, we received $353 million from 13 bilateral agencies. We're talking about the French Development Agency, the German DEZ, the UK DFID, in supporting us working with emerging market government, how to improve regulatory environment so that private sector can thrive, right? So Europe is playing a major role. On climate change, last December, the French government, the United Nations, and the World Bank did the One Planet Summit, really re-energize the international community to renew its commitment on fighting climate change. So I just wanted to say that Europe is extremely relevant in supporting multilateralism as very, very responsive shareholders of the World Bank Group, and I see that's very, very positive. On China, I just wanted to reflect, because ISC's advocacy is to say to every country we go to is that private sector is critical for your economic future. We have not seen any country succeed without building a vibrant private sector, with private sector taking the lead in the economic activity. So we have invested in China over $14, $15 billion, right, over the past 30 years, really have contributed our part. So, I got a number from the web that says, the private sector growth in China can be represented by the number 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, right? Which is a big contrast when I left China 29 years ago, where private sector was non-existent. So China's tax revenue, 50% came from private sector, right? 60% of Chinese GDP is generated by the private sector. 70% of technology innovation came from private sector. 80% of the employment in urban and in city areas are generated by the private sector. And over 90% of number of companies are private sector, right? So, judging by this, I think China's private sector has already become a predominant force in creating economic activities. Another thing I would always joke to say, right? In 1990, when I left China, if people ask me, so Jingdong, what is a bond? I said, I know, it's James Bond, because that's the only bond I knew, right? But China now has a corporate bond and government bond market is at over $10 trillion. So China is using a market mechanism to recycle its savings to its infrastructure financing to SMEs. So for example, one of our clients in China is called Ant Financial. It's part of the Alibaba Group, right? It's not that they need our money for their global expansion, but one thing they did was that they lent to 10 million micro entrepreneurs in China. These are the e-merchants, right? They go to a typical commercial bank. They will never get a loan because the commercial bank will say, you don't have collaterals, right? You only rent your shop from your apartment. But Ant Financial was able, using AI, as you said, to figure out a way to lend to those very small enterprises, which is key in creating jobs, right? So we were able to work with Ant Financial to structure capital market solutions, right? To recycle their capital through Shanghai Stock Exchange. So they issued uncollateralized asset-backed security so that they can use capital market to raise more funds to lend to those small micro enterprise. So I just want to use these examples to share that we have seen that China's private sector becoming more dynamic, playing a much more important role. Another thing I wanted to mention, because Europe is one of the forerunners of regional integration, right? We're talking about European integration. I just want to say that one landmark development, of course, also following ASEAN Plus 3, 44 African countries out of 54 in March this year in Kigali signed a landmark free trade agreement called the Pan-Africa Free Trade Area. And their commitment is to reduce intra-Africa trade tax to zero. And that is quite significant in reducing barriers, creating jobs, and letting logistics, e-commerce, and infrastructure to flourish. So from that point of view, I think Europe integration also has lessons that this Africa regional integration can learn from. So I'll stop.
I'm going to turn back to my right side again. And it looks like I'm changing the subject dramatically, but I'm not. You mentioned something very interesting, which is currency. And I was at the Lujiazui Forum this year, and there wasn't talk about liberalizing the renminbi. There was talk about the shortcomings of a world in which the US dollar is the only reserve currency. And the fact that people are no longer talking about the euro largely as a reserve currency, I think is symbolic of the kind of weakness that you referred to in Europe generally. So I wanted to ask you both, and I'll start with you, Mr. Prime Minister, what can Europe actually do to kind of regain, you know, the energy it once had to play more of a role, to make, you know, the euro a possible reserve currency in the world again, just as a shorthand for that?
Yeah, during years, the world and the European country had accepted the idea that the dollar is the only international currency. What is changing is the way the US government and the US administration use the dollar to impose to other countries their view, especially on foreign policy. And I think with the last crisis between Europe and US about Iran, we are at the limit of the exercise. The US government decided to denounce the treaty about the agreement about Iran nuclear project. The Europeans don't agree. The Europeans support the agreement. But no one European company will be able tomorrow to work in Iran, even if the European government are supporting the agreement. Total decided to leave Iran because Total fear American sanction. Peugeot, you speak about Peugeot. Peugeot stopped its project in Iran. So it's an example, but it's not acceptable. The US are going too far. And I think the only way for Europe to resist to this imperialist policy, it's to make the euro an international currency. How? It's not easy to. It's not possible to decree that euro will be tomorrow a true international currency. The only way, and I'm not sure my friend Peter will agree with that, the only way is to harmonize the fiscal situation in Europe. I think we can, not with all the country, but the country who are using euro. we can harmonize the company's fiscality in 5 years and household fiscality in 10 years. For that, we need a very strong economic European government with a chief of state and a small dedicated general secretary to do it. But for me, it's very important because we did the euro. I was against when the debate, but now we have this European currency. We have this problem with the US and with the dollar, and now the Chinese are trying to make their currency an international one. And I'm sure that in the next 10 years, the European company which made some business, some trade with China, will have to do it in Chinese currency. So Europe is going to lose everything in this confrontation. So it's the reason I think we need a euro which will become a real international currency.
We only have a few minutes left, but Peter, I wanted to pick up on, as you answer this question, you had mentioned technology earlier in your remarks, Lord Mandelson. Is Europe, what do you need to do to make Europe at the forefront of innovation? Or is that hopeless?
It's not hopeless at all. We have the most extraordinarily advanced, sophisticated research and development, science-based system of research-based universities. We have greater capability than any set of nations anywhere else in the world. So the platform is extremely strong. The availability of capital is great. The entrepreneurship in Europe is also strong, but there's a certain linkage between the innovation, the R&D, the capital, the entrepreneurship, that's not quite connecting in the way that it needs to in Europe. And in my view, venture capital is, to a greater extent, the missing link in this European system. Let me, however, just go back, if I may, to what Francois Fillon has said, because his friend Peter actually agrees with what he is saying. Look, we're facing in the world a situation in which the US government is trying every day even harder to weaponize the dollar. To weaponize the dollar. That is unacceptable to the rest of the world, whether we're Japanese, Chinese, European, Singaporeans. It is simply not acceptable for one country to weaponize its currency in that way in order to impose its policies, its will, and its sanctions targeting countries, individuals, different businesses, anywhere in the world, simply because they have the audacity to have come into contact with the dollar at some point in their lives.
Extraterritoriality.
What it represents is a sort of transition of the United States, temporarily, I hope, from the world's policeman to the world's bully. I don't believe that is going to last beyond President Trump's tenure in the White House. I certainly hope not, and that the US reverts to a more sort of communal multilateral stance. But let me just say this about the European currency, because I agree. It needs to strengthen, it needs to become a reserve currency for the world. But for that to happen, it both has to sort of collectivize and pool the risks within the Eurozone, And it also needs a framework of policy that can be applied and enforced when it comes to fiscal and other policies. So it needs to collectivize risk, and it needs to instill discipline. The problem at the moment is that in the case of France, that country, that leading member of the Eurozone, tends to prioritize the pooling of risk as well as the development of policy frameworks. In the case of Germany, they prioritize the imposing enforcement of discipline.
I'm going to cut you off there because we
let
have
me
30
make my
seconds left.
last sentence then. You cannot have the one without the other. You need both. And until France and Germany can agree a combination of policies to bring about the conclusion of the Euro's architecture, then we will not be seeing that currency transitioning as we would wish it to become a strong reserve currency for the world.
We're going 30 seconds over our time. David, yes or no question for you. In 5 years, will the renminbi be a reserve currency in the world?
Not as big as the dollar, no. It's heading in that direction, but it'll be a lot longer than that. You may see patches of it, but no one will rival the dollar in the next 5 years.
Tamura-san, do you agree with that?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Just can I say
Please.
just a word? I was very pessimistic when I came in this room, but after hearing a so famous British who agree with my idea of a euro as an international currency, I'm very optimistic.
Let's end quickly. Let's end quickly.